I'm Kathryn Buxton, and since discovering the joy of meditation in my late 30s, I've been on a journey of self-discovery that has introduced me to some fascinating ideas. Join me as I take a deeper dive into the areas of our well-being that we just don't give enough attention to. Would our lives really be any better if we took our well-being seriously? Each week I'll be joined by a well-being specialist to unpick the value of sleep, nutrition, kindness and so much more. This is Things You Should Care About podcast in association with Isbourne.org. I just like to say a very warm welcome to you, Kimberley, and to those of you that are listening, please grab yourself a nice warm drink and maybe some biscuits to dunk in as well. Settle yourselves down. This is Kathryn Buxton recording for Things You Should Care About with the Isbourne.org, and we are today with the lovely Kimberley Pena. Now, Kimberley, before we start chatting, I wondered whether you can remember the first time we met.
This is to do with my muse, wasn't it?
It is.
It is.
And you remember it.
As soon as I saw your face, I was like, you're the amazing lady that introduced me to that incredible music. And I'll tell you something that I didn't tell you at the time. Mm-hmm. When I heard it, because I was in the therapy room just finishing a session and I was clearing up and I heard the music and I thought that there was a choir in the office. I said that there are some people singing live. And then when I went to you, and you know what, that soundtrack, I bought both of their albums and they have really supported me during this pandemic. That music, oh my goodness me, it was part of my hypnobirthing situation and it was just amazing.
That is such a lovely thing to hear.
Yeah.
It is lovely.
Profound impact.
Yeah, and nice that you heard it via me, so that's even better.
Yeah.
So Kimberley, you are a dance psychotherapist, is that right?
Yeah, dance movement psychotherapist.
Movement psychotherapist. So how did you get into A, being a psychotherapist, and B, being a dance movement psychotherapist?
Well, my journey is very much starting within the dance world. I was a professional dancer touring and within musical theatres around the UK, but also in London's West End. And because of the role that I was doing, a lot of the families that may come and see the show would contact our company manager if they had fallen ill between purchasing a ticket and then coming to see the show, and often ask if we were able to do a meet and greet or we were able to actually go and visit them in the hospitals themselves. And that then grew bigger into becoming involved in more of charity-based work, so charities like Make-A-Wish Foundation and Great Ormond Street. And for me, using dance in that way of going to meet people and communicating and supporting someone in a very distressing situation opened my eyes to the healing benefits of dance. And if I'm honest, throughout my dance training, I never came across dance movement psychotherapy. It was very much the kind of the more entertainment-based, the way that we stereotypically recognize dance in terms of its art form. But during that little piece of work alongside the shows, I then wanted to understand more about how I could possibly work more in that arena in terms of healing and support. I knew about drama therapy, never knew about dance movement psychotherapy. So I started researching it, and then I found out that it was a master's training. And it was one of those situations where I had to make a decision between, because the dance movement psychotherapy training, as you can imagine, because it's in the field of psychotherapy, it's an intense 3 years master's, and the third year of that master's is placement work, where you are literally in mental health settings and you are working alongside multidisciplinary settings with psychiatrists, psychologists, occupational health therapists. So it's a very intense 3 years. So when you make the decision about doing the training, it's not a case of, I'm just going to dibble and dabble on this on the side while I do my main job, that kind of side hustle situation. But then things progress where the transition needed to happen. And I think for me, I needed to experience movement and dance more than just the aesthetic and more than just I am the performer, you are the audience. I knew that dance was always about connection, but I really wanted that more in a much more tangible way, a less of a show busy way, and much more of the embodiment of what it means to be in human connection through movement and dance. So that was my journey into the training.
So can you identify a moment or a time when you had that feeling that, that just dancing for people was just somehow not enough for you, that you wanted to move it into something more meaningful?
I think if you speak to any professional dancer, I think that moment is when you are dancing your heart out within an audition setting amongst maybe 50 other dancers, and your heart is in it, you're dancing to the music, and you know, wanting everything to be in that audition room, and obviously further than that, get the job, and then finishing the sequence and then being cut as if whatever you had just performed was meaningless, was nothing. And it was such a contrasting situation to have an embodied experience of feeling euphoria, and obviously your body's sweating, your heart is pumping. If you're a lover of dance, you know, you get that thrill, whatever context you're dancing, and then to be met with this very in some ways very dehumanizing kind of
cold. Yeah,
exactly, that is the word, cold shut down of your expression, because that's what dance is, it's self-expression. But I think in the industry you become a product, and I think there's a danger where you start moving and being in your body to serve a productivity and someone else's vision. And I think that's dangerous, because you start moving away from your own authentic voice and your own subjectivity. And that is where, you know, I do a lot of work within dancers' mental health. And I think that is where sometimes those in the performing arts industry can become very overwhelmed and very distressed very quickly.
So what is it when you work with somebody? Are you sort of merging together those two views, your kind of subjective view and their subjective view of whatever it is that they're going through?
Yes, so in the session itself, I think the first thing to say is that within a dance movement psychotherapy session, the idea of dance is or the concept of dance is very different to what we're shown within the media, or kind of what our social construction of dance is.
So you're saying it's not strictly, is that what you're saying?
No, exactly, yes, I want to say that very clearly. Because it's funny, I get a lot of people say, oh no, dance isn't for me, so dance movement psychotherapy isn't the type of modality for me. And obviously, you know, it's up to the client to feel comfortable in the modality that they want to explore their own personal process. But what I would say is the idea of dance movement psychotherapy, the dance part, is more about the metaphor of communication. So how we're talking now, Kathryn, is very much a dance, you know, the pausing, the fluidity of it, the kind of the stopping, the starting. And dance in dance movement psychotherapy is purely about creative self-expression. So that's really what I'm supporting people to do. And it can be hugely powerful for those who find articulating their experiences, or their distress, or their feelings of overwhelm difficult. And so we start with non-verbal communication, the movement, to begin the start of that process of discovering and understanding more about what's going on for that person. So it's not a dance class in terms of, you know, me directing movement at all. Like, I'm not directing movement at all. It's totally client-led. And sometimes in the session, the client and I, we don't move at all. The movement part is the breath in the room. The movement part is actually the 30 minutes of stillness, where whatever that thing that somebody needed to speak about was so overwhelming and so difficult, it was the heaviness in the room, that all that was needed in that moment is just to be held by another person in terms of the witnessing of someone's distress. So, and that's a dance in itself, the pause to just be in the distress together and be supported by another human being.
That sounds really lovely. Now, I did 4.5 years of psychotherapy, Kimberley, and I mean, it was the most challenging and the most rewarding period of my life, actually. It was fantastic, but also very difficult too. But I could not imagine my therapist and I dancing around, you know, her living room. It would feel very, very strange. So how do you, when that first person walks through the door, how do you ease them into that? How do you get them to do that?
So I think first and foremost, the therapeutic relationship is the cornerstone of all of this. So like I said, sometimes the movement element of our sessions don't start until maybe the 5th session or even the 6th session, because the first sessions are all about building up that trust. Because particularly within our Western society, there's a lot of shame associated with the body. And so the idea of them bringing the body into movement, you know, and we always hear these things like dance like nobody's watching. got a very cultural, socially constructed taboo about the moving body, and so that sometimes is very evident within the room. So the first few sessions is just about building up that trust, but also build up some of the idea and concept of it's okay and you're safe to be in your body. And I think that's the starting point. It's building someone's trust in me and also building someone's safety in their own body to then begin to start moving it. And like I said, the movement can be so subtle. Fingertips can be moving, the breath can be moving, a head can be moving. You know, I might even state back to somebody, you know, when I hear you talk about XYZ, I notice that you hold your body in a certain posture, and I just want to know, are you aware of that when you do it? And that can become metaphorically the dance of the session, just understanding, oh, I hold my hand when I say that person's name, or I've noticed that my breath gets quicker when I think about myself when I was 11. You know, all of those different parts. It's about almost being a mirror to the person in front of me to support them re-establishing a relationship with their body, and then further than that, re-establishing a relationship to their moving body.
It's very interesting you were saying about people's attitudes towards dance, because a friend of mine has come back from, a few years ago, not now, obviously because of COVID, but she's come back from a tour of Africa, and she was in Kenya and in South Africa. And we were talking the other day, and she was saying how dance is so much a part of Native Africans' culture. You know, they dance when they're going into school, they dance when they come out of school, the kids, you know, they dance on their way home and sing, and it's a massive part. Whereas in our culture, it feels like dance is almost, like you say, a little bit shameful, or something that you only do after you've, you know, drunk quite a bit of wine, or drunk a lot of alcohol, and you feel confident enough to go onto the dance floor in a very kind of stylized and in a very kind of fixed way. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's that kind of cultural difference? What is it about in the West, or us, you know, that can't relax into dance so much?
I think it's historical. I think it's so deep rooted into the patriarchal system, if I'm honest, because the body has been something that has been denied, because there's a fear of what can be done if we fully embody ourselves. There's been an absolutely overwhelming prioritization of the mind and the cognitions, because that's something that control, and there's an element of it's science driven, so it's much more tangible in terms of there is data and there is a quantitative side of understanding. And as we know, our forefathers within psychology and psychotherapy were all male-led. And the body in all of that was always something that was suppressed. I think historically also the idea of being expressive through our bodies was seen to be very primitive. And that was something that historically was something that was wrong, and we shouldn't be in our bodies. And there was also in terms of race, there was an idea that to be in our bodies was to be like our brothers and sisters in our African cultures, and therefore there was this drive to be the counter to that. And like you said, your friend, recognizing that absolutely African communities are embodied. It's the most beautiful thing to witness. They mourn through dance, they celebrate through dance, they are expressing themselves totally in mind and body throughout their whole existence. And I think that's something that we as our Western culture, in a time we used to want to avoid, it's time that we actually learned and understood that we need to experience that as well.
So what is it about dance that you find to be so healing?
I think dance, it's a really big question to answer. I think when we dance and when we engage in creative movement, we are able to be our truest self, because we are allowing our mind to be equal to our body. So there's the idea of psyche and soma coming together. Neither of them prioritized, neither of them more powerful than the other, but both equal. And when our mind and body are equalized and we're moving in that way, that is when we become our most wholesome, and that is when we become our most true. I think anybody who's experienced dance for dance sake, and I don't mean copying a choreography, I mean just putting on some music in their kitchen or their bedroom and just moving because they need to move, whether it be out of anger, whether it be out of excitement, whatever the emotion behind. When we move, we feel alive, and obviously if we are feeling unwell or unhealthy, feeling alive is our first step to regaining our health, or experiencing what health feels like within us.
I mean, I can remember vividly a time when I was dancing at a Christmas party, and just really enjoying moving my body, and people kept coming up and saying, "You must be really drunk, Kathryn. What have you had to drink?" And I don't drink, so I had nothing to drink at all. And people couldn't believe that. You know what I mean? They couldn't understand how I could just have fun and enjoy dancing without having some alcohol. Yeah. Which is a bit sad, really, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think, you know, you mentioned about, you know, I see that often in terms of people feeling they can only dance if they've had a drink. And I think it's such a shame, because dance, if drink is needed to have a dance, there's an understanding there in some ways, and it's an assumption, but there's a want there, isn't there? There's a drive. I want to be able to dance, but I need this drink to allow myself to. And if we just gave ourselves permission to just be and stop thinking about the potential judgment of others, or allowing ourselves to just, I mean, like I said, as you know, I've had a baby during this lockdown period, and it's been a real eye-opener for me in terms of the developmental stages that we all go through as evolving humans. And seeing a child just move their bodies for the sake of movement, to understand themselves, but to also understand the world around us, that is something that is innate to all of us. Yet as we've grown up, we've lost the capacity or the ability to find that an okay way of understanding our world. So how amazing would it be as adults, it's not about relearning a skill, it's about going back to something that we've done as babies, you know, using movement to understand, oh, this is me, and then that's my environment. And if we could do that as adults, I think we would be more able to feel in general healthier and potentially happier in our existence.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely, because I mean, one of the things I notice when I meditate, or when I teach meditation, is it's inviting people to be playful, and they find that sometimes quite difficult, because they're expecting some kind of linear approach to it, that I'll start off here and I'll end up there, and it'll all be okay. But being playful and curious, and looking into things in a more childlike way, it takes people sometimes quite a bit of time to kind of understand that. And I guess that's what you're inviting people to do through dance therapy, to be playful and curious. Yeah,
absolutely. And I would go, hearing you say that, Kathryn, I'd go one step further to add that I think during this time, during the year of 2020, and all that has been going on, and the chaos that surrounds us, it's probably been the first time that as a society we haven't had a map. And I think we've kind of evolved in a way that we need maps. You know, people need to know this goes to this and this goes, and I like the structure, and the structure allows me to know what I'm doing. But this year has kind of opened us in, or invited us into, an experience where there is no map, and so we've got to be okay with the not knowing, and that has invited a general sense of playfulness and curiosity and creativity. So in many ways, I think in terms of the impact on our mental health, I think that the arts in general, the art psychotherapies, whether that be dance movement psychotherapy, art psychotherapy, music psychotherapy, all of those, I think there's going to be a greater need potentially, because people have had a first-hand experience of the value of that playfulness, that creativity, that freedom of expression to understand themselves and better manage some of their difficulties.
Yeah, and I think also there's been an opportunity for us to take stock, isn't there? Take time off and take kind of stock of what it is we really want out of life. And you know, I'm constantly hearing through social media or newspapers and etc. is that people have really valued the time just to slow down and to really stop and look and listen and taste. And for example, like you being a new mum, having the time to be with the ones that you really want to be. So there's big questions I think we have to ask ourselves about the kind of society we want to go back to. You know, whether we go back to the way things were. I don't think we necessarily do. I think playfulness has been great. But I think sometimes also playfulness might be slightly easier for younger people, am I right, than older people? So do you find in your dance psychotherapy sessions you have a lot of adolescents, younger people, or older people, or is it
It's a real mixed client group, I would say. So in context for listeners, just to understand a little bit about my work. So I am part-time NHS, part-time private practice. So in the NHS, I work within the lifespan service for eating disorders in Berkshire. And then in my private practice, I see anyone who is interested in knowing more about how dance and psychotherapy could support them. So within my private practice, again, my oldest client I think is in their 40s, 50s, and then my youngest client has been age 11. So it's a real kind of spectrum of ages. And really, I don't think that there is an age that responds better to dance movement psychotherapy. I think it's very person specific, depending on what their needs are. What I would say, interestingly, is I also run group, or I did before the pandemic, group dance movement psychotherapy workshops. And interestingly, I always found that the age bracket seemed to be more adult than the groups that were for the adolescents. And I think there's something about, there's a sense of fear maybe around young people or parents allowing young people to come together to support maybe anxiety or self-harming behaviours, or whatever the bracket of topic that the workshop covers, because there's this idea that, or putting young people who are distressed together is a bad thing because they'll learn things from each other that are maladaptive. But actually what I found is that allowing young people to come together in their distress can be hugely cathartic and hugely supportive for them, feeling not alone in their experiences. And I think in terms of mental health, there's sometimes we feel very isolated and very alone in how we're feeling. We feel like we're the only ones. And if we think about young people, again, this is a stereotype perhaps, but they may be more engaged within social media, where everything is very glossy and everyone's having the best time of their lives. So when you're not having the best time of your lives and you're looking at social media, you feel even more isolated. But actually behind all those very filtered and pretty pictures, everybody's probably going through the same difficulties. So bringing young people together in groups, I think, is really, really valuable.
So it's across the age group. You can have young children and older people as well. What's the kind of typical things that people come to you with, problems or issues that they'd like you to explore with them?
Anxiety is the biggest one, I'd say. There's always the main anxiety, and then in the session we uncover sometimes there's a trauma that's happened and there hasn't been a recognition or an acceptance of that trauma, and so there's been this underlying anxiety that's continued to kind of mask everything else. I've had quite a few private young people who have been diagnosed with an eating disorder, and I think that has partly to do with finding it difficult to get treatment under the NHS services, so people are looking for private support. And another one is just a sense of feeling lost in identity. I often work with a lot of people who have got to a stage in their life where they really don't know who they are anymore. And most of the way that dance movement psychotherapy can help with that, like I said at the beginning, because we focus so much on rebuilding a relationship with the self through the body and the mind, a lot of the work can be hugely powerful for that demographic that just feel abandoned in themselves. So bringing the movement and the body and the mind all together in one therapy session can be just very there can be a real alchemy in the room.
So it's for all age groups. Do you have to be good at dance to do it?
Absolutely not.
No,
absolutely not. And I would say if there's a part of you listening to this podcast and you think, oh God, dance, no, I can't dance. Oh, don't dance, no. I think the more you resist, my invitation to that person would be, the more I think you should come to a session, because if you're denying that part of you, which is ultimately, let's just scrap the whole, dance in a theatre, dance on Strictly Come Dancing. Ultimately, dance is about self-expression. So if there's a part of you that's denying your own self-expression, my invitation to you would be, why? what is so fearful about your self-expression that you are denying yourself a huge part of. So I would say, if you are that person listening and, oh, not for me, I'd say, come and have a session, come and meet me, or find other dance movement psychotherapist in your local area that's registered and experienced, and have a session.
That sounds really good. I might have to take you up on that, Kimberley. Does it work? Have you ever had anybody that it hasn't worked for, or is it just an example that perhaps the dance wasn't the problem, but just the therapy they didn't take to?
To be honest, I've never had an experience where it's difficult within therapy, the idea of it working and not working, because in the way that I train, I'm a strong believer that in terms of the therapy, if there is tension or there are barriers, that's part of the therapy work. That if someone is thinking, oh, this isn't working, to bring that to the session and to say to me, this feels really stuck, I'm not sure why I don't feel any different, because that is almost always where the work needs to be done, this kind of resistance to change. So I haven't had any direct experience of someone saying to me, this isn't working, but what I would say is that it's always client-led. So I never push someone into movement or push someone into speaking about something. It's always led by that person. So I hope that has been the reason why I've never experienced anyone say to me, I'm finding this stressful or difficult or negative, because it's always been led at their pace. And I think if as therapists, whatever modality you work in, as long as you're leading at the client's pace, I think there's always positive change will always happen.
You're absolutely right there, because I can remember my own experience of having psychotherapy, is that the times that I felt stuck or felt angry or felt like I wanted to give up, those were the richest times, actually. Yes. Those were the really juicy stuff, because we were getting into some real nitty-gritty things that I needed to explore. And often that resistance was because I didn't want to go there. I just didn't want to go there. I didn't want to go to that difficult place. So I did. So in a therapy session, Kimberley, do you actually dance with your client? Or do you sit and watch, or what's the kind of dynamic?
Mixture. So a typical session would start where we would have what I call a check-in. So that would be most probably a verbal check-in, with the client would come and would sit down either on chairs or on cushions. If they want to feel more grounded on the floor, we might go straight onto the floor. And we would check in and see how the client had been between the session of last week, what had happened that day, is there anything in particular they wanted to bring to the session. And then more often than not, that verbal check-in would then establish a theme for the rest of the session. And again, sometimes the session can be all verbal and we don't use any movement, but sometimes I might invite the client, or should we move some of that? A good example would be if the client had brought a lot of tension or anger, we might use movement as a way of releasing some of that tension, or we might use movement as a way of expressing some of that anger. Anger is an amazing example in dance movement psychotherapy, because I think, again, within our society, there's a taboo about the safe ways of expressing anger. And I think the therapy space, especially the movement therapy space, can be a really brilliant holding space to engage and experience anger and not feeling overwhelmed by it. So like I said, a theme might evolve, and then we might explore that with movement. I use a lot of music and a lot of props also. So again, the props can support the body in expressing things. I use a lot of stretch cloths, and many times I have grown adults wrapping themselves in these kind of cocoon-like experiences to experience the idea of being held or hidden. And so that's where the really creative element of movement, which equals dance, is really found in the session.
So what other kind of props? I'm intrigued by the props that you use.
Oh, lots. Oh gosh, name something and I probably have it in my toolkit. So lots of fabrics, lots of different balls, lots of small objects. So my training is integrative. So a lot of my work is based within the Gestalt area. So a lot of objects can be a really powerful tool of projection identification. And if listeners who don't maybe understand that phrase, it's about using an object that allows someone to take a bit of a separation from the experience or the emotion behind it. So a stone, for example, could represent a feeling, or it could represent a person. And sometimes we might place those props in different areas of the room, and one corner will represent the past and we'll move in the past, and then another corner of the room will represent the present and we'll move in the present, and then another corner of the room will be the future and we'll move in the future, and different props will allow that person to have a more in-depth connection to just the room. So yeah, so it's a real creative hub really, and the more, like going back to what you said, the more playful a person can be, I would say the richer the process becomes.
And do you invite people to bring in their own props?
Yeah, I do. And also inviting people to bring in music that has a memory association or a particular lyric that they feel attuned to or connected with. So obviously music can also be a great holding space when either the body in the room can't move and also the mind in the room can't speak. So sometimes music can be both the way to not fill the space, because it's not about filling the space, but communicating something that may be very distressing.
And typically, how long does the session last, Kimberley?
So my sessions last an hour. Sometimes, depending on where a person's at within their process, I sometimes extend to an hour and a half. I've had quite a few clients when we've got to a particular, I wouldn't say difficult. It's hard to use the right word sometimes, because I think when we say difficult, it's not difficult. It's there's a weight. There's a weight. Yeah, there's a heaviness, a larger weight to what's being brought, and so we do sometimes extend it, because I think it's really important that towards an end of a session there is a closure, because when we use the body, there is potential that there is even more overwhelm to be experienced. And so it's really important that towards the end of the session there's a real process of grounding and allowing someone to come back to an experience of themselves that's manageable, to leave the session room and get back in the car and drive to your home or your job, or walk down the high street to pick up that chicken that you needed to buy, or whatever it is that you then do. Sessions don't happen in isolation, they happen in the middle of a day. So it's really important that every client feels ready after doing a session to go back into the rest of their day. So the grounding part of a session at the end is very, very important.
Yeah, that's nice to hear, because when I did my psychotherapy, it was 50 minutes, and it was 50 minutes on the dot. At the end of 50 minutes, it was expected to finish and go. And I mean, I got used to that, and that was fine. But it's very intriguing to hear you saying that you allow those sessions to go on for slightly sort of longer. So I wonder why that is. I mean, you explained that because you've reached a rich place that you feel you want to explore sort of more. So it's always about building that real trust, isn't there, between you and your client. Yeah. Also your client trusting you too.
I think it's the best way. I mean, if a session is longer, it's always known that it's longer between the client and the therapist. It's not a case of I notice in, say, for example, if it was an hour session and things were evolving, I wouldn't extend it in that regard. If it was an extension session, the client would already know. But I think the best way of understanding it's a bit like if we know we're going to run a marathon, we know that we need a cool down process. So if the client knows that we're doing an hour and a half, I know structurally in a session I've got to use that last 15 minutes to allow that person to cool down, to come back to a more regulated experience of their mind and body before I allow them to leave the room. And that's just in terms of my safe practice and ethical boundaries in making sure that my clients are safe after they leave a session with me.
Yeah. And typically, how long do not length of the sessions, but how long do the sessions go on for? Was it sort of months or years or?
Yeah, that's
the longest client been with you for?
Oh, that's a really good question. How long is my longest client? Let me think. I think my longest client has been with me now still approaching 4 years. Yeah. But then equally, I've had clients who've seen me for maybe 3 months. So that question is a bit like, how long is a piece of string? I think it really is just dependent on the need and also the age of the person. And I think some people come to therapy knowing exactly what they want to work on. And it's a very structured, very focused piece of work, whether it be they've experienced a trauma, that they're still processing a bereavement, whether they notice that they're inclined to self-harm, or, whatever the difficulty is. And then other people come to the session not really having a clear focus, but just knowing that there's something that doesn't feel connected, or something that doesn't feel right within their experience in the self, and they want to work on that. And those are sometimes the clients that the length of time can be unending, because the focus of work is so different. It's more about personal process in life as opposed to this particular difficulty or this particular experience that I want to learn how to manage or understand better, or even recognize it.
Do you feel you know when the ending's coming?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's difficult is helping the client recognize that. Yeah.
How do you know when it's going to stop? What is it? Is it individual to each client? Is it just something, a feeling that you get?
Gosh, Kathryn, these questions are so big. I don't even know how to answer this one. If I'm honest, I don't think there's an answer to that, because I don't think, and this is going to sound so existential, so I don't think we ever know the ending is coming or the ending is ready. I think it's just about trusting that if we end and it hasn't been the right time, that process will re-engage or restart. And if we end and it is the right time, that ending will feel, there will be like an exhale to it. There will be okay, that felt difficult to finish, maybe, because like you said, saying goodbye to your therapist, especially if you've been working with that person for a long time, can be, it's like saying goodbye to a really good friend, but it's kind of like a false reality, because you're not friends with that person. There's been a transaction between client and therapist. So I think endings in general are really hard, but I think when the ending is right, there is a gut sense of satisfaction, or yeah, like I said, the word exhale springs to mind. There's a feeling like, okay, that was hard to do, but I've exhaled and I feel like I can breathe still on my own. I don't need another person to help me breathe. I think as well, there's an idea that if you've had therapy, whatever modality you go through, that once you've had it, that's it, that I've had that now, I've done psychotherapy. But I think in general, we experience the need for support within different chapters and different seasons of our lives. And I think, as well as the dance movement psychotherapist, I sometimes get a lot of people that may be curious about working with me, but then they might say, oh, I've had this type of therapy, or I've had CBT, or whatever it is, and it didn't really do anything, so I know therapy is not for me. And I really get disheartened by that, because I think, actually, regardless of the modality, I really strongly believe that therapy is about the connection through the therapeutic relationship. And you might have a therapist that you don't maybe connect very well with, and so then you think, oh, therapy is not for me, I tried that and it didn't work. But actually, maybe it was just that particular therapist you didn't have a good match with, and you didn't feel comfortable enough to explore some of those deeper issues. So anyone who's listening who thinks, oh, I've done therapy, it was part of old faff, like it didn't help and I'm still struggling or whatever, I would really encourage that person, explore a little bit, be creative about who you might want to work with. Because I kind of had this metaphor that in my head, therapy is a little bit like shoes. There's so many different varieties of shoes. Just because if you try one pair and they didn't fit quite right, or they're a little bit comfortable on the walk, or they gave you blisters, doesn't mean shoes aren't for you. It just might mean that there's another type of shoe out there that's going to fit much better for you and give you that support that you really need and really deserve.
I always thought that therapy was actually about love. I think it's the most perfect expression of love, actually. And a friend of mine was saying, why? And I said, because it's boundaried. You know when your time with your therapist starts, and you know when the time ends, and within that you have a wonderful opportunity to explore yourself, but to explore what love is all about. And then it's a boundary session where you then have to leave that, you have to go. And so it's teaching how to trust and how to love somebody, but in a very boundaried way.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think hearing you say that really makes me think about, as you've heard me say a lot on this podcast, I talk about supporting a majority of my clients fundamentally building a relationship with themselves. And ultimately that's building their relationship, building themselves back in love with themselves. The idea of self-love is also such a taboo in our society, like the idea to love myself, like that's just something for narcissists. Well, no, like that's a core foundation of supporting ourselves to heal, and more than that, just supporting ourselves to live in a very full-hearted way.
So do you love your clients, Kimberley?
I think there definitely is an element of love in the room, and I would say that on a personal note, it isn't always easy to step away from a client. There's, you know, in terms of you hearing you say about boundaries, sometimes it can be very difficult to finish a session on a day and then not carry that person in my mind on my drive back to home, or do my washing up and not be thinking about the story that client S had been talking to me about, or knowing that this person has got a particular life event coming up and I know the date of it and I'm there stood on the day of that date and my mind can go to that person. So there's a real invisible thread between therapist and client, and I think as long as the therapist is aware of that, I think that's a safe place. But I think the moment we start saying things like, oh, you know, I just do the session, I get out, I do it, I come back in, it's all done, I don't think about my clients at all. I think there's a great sense of denial there, because I think we all are very deeply connected, because we're all very deeply human, and to not be connected to our clients, I think we would be denying something that's very human. You know, we can't sit opposite another human being in distress and not feel that huge overwhelming sense of compassion, empathy and love.
Do you have somebody that you go to talk to? Do you have a supervisor?
Oh yes, very good relationship with my supervisor. So I see a senior dance movement psychotherapist, and she's amazing. I've literally had her since I finalized my training, so she's been completely with me throughout my whole journey. So seeing me as my evolving, you know, new therapist kind of anxiety to now, obviously 7 years later. And yeah, and I genuinely could not do my job without her, because she is my mirror, she is my sounding board, she is my holder, she is my confidant, she is my teacher, she is my inspirer. Like I think all therapists, obviously we, as to keep our registration, our insurance, we need supervisors, but I think I feel very blessed that my supervisor, I just have a great relationship, and I know that I can count on this person if ever a crisis for me comes up in terms of my client relationships, or just someone who just understands the weight of what we do on a day-to-day basis.
I've got one last question for you, and I'm asking it to everybody that's doing the podcast, and it's, what one piece of advice has someone given you that you would like to pass on?
So I was thinking about this, and I think the piece of advice that has really stuck with me, it was interesting because when I first heard that question, when I saw it in the email, knowing that I'd be asked it, nothing really struck me, nothing really popped to mind very quickly. And as I kind of reflected on it, my parents have always said to me, do what makes you happy. Whatever you do, it doesn't matter what you do, just do what makes you happy. And I think now more than ever, that piece of advice is something that I don't want to dismiss, because I think sometimes we get so caught up in this kind of do it all, be a productivity, how productive have you been today, that these tangible things result in happiness, I think can be a very dangerous place to be in our world. And I think, again, the pandemic has allowed this kind of subtle slowing down to go, actually, it's just the simple things that make me happy. So my piece of advice is find happiness in whatever you're doing, and try to find happiness in yourself with just you, because I think that's really needed at the moment, that sense of joy in the small things. And that has been something that's been encouraged by my parents, and they are the root of my existence. So I owe a lot to them.
A lovely thing to end on, Kimberley. It's so lovely to speak to you. How do people get hold of you if they're interested in exploring working with you?
So I think the best place to find me would be my website, which is www.movingthroughlife.co.uk. I am also on social media. My account is at Kimberley RDMP. RDMP just stands for Registered Dance Movement Psychotherapist. But I also hope to be back at the Isbourne in the new year, offering some face-to-face sessions. So I'm also contactable through the Isbourne. So yeah, I think those are the main places. Oh, and also just to clarify, because my surname is a little bit confusing. So my married name, as a feminist, I've double barreled. So my married name is Pena Medhurst. So people might Google Kimberley Pena Medhurst, and that's my married name. But my professional name is actually Kimberley Pena. And that's, if you want to find anything to do with me and dance through psychotherapy or any of the publications that I've written, podcasts, blah, 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 then that, so Google Kimberley Pena and then you'll find me.
That's lovely, Kimberley. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.